here. Now, today's discussion is going to focus on scaling up finance for adaptation and mobilising private finance towards the $100 billion goal for providing and mobilising finance to support climate action in developing countries. And this follows the recent OECD publication of a climate finance package that came out in 3 parts. One, tracking progress towards meeting that $100 billion goal. A second, a special report looking at the barriers to and options for increasing adaptation finance. And a third report doing a similar job looking at the barriers to and options for increasing the mobilisation of private finance. Now, we're going to begin today. We're very honoured to have the OECD Secretary-General, Matthias Cormann, and Canada's Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Steven Guilbeault. I'm going to ask each of them to kick things off very shortly. And following their remarks, we will move to a panel discussion featuring 4 great speakers who I will introduce after those opening remarks. We've allowed around quarter of an hour, of course, for audience questions at the end, and I really hope we can have a lively exchange of ideas. So let's get the show on the road. I'm going to ask Matthias to come and make some opening remarks for us.
Well, thank you. Yep. Is it working? Perfect. Thank you very much, Joe, dear Minister Guilbeault, dear Jennifer Morgan, dear panelists, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends all. A very warm welcome to this joint OECD-Canada COP28 side event on scaling up adaptation finance and private finance mobilisation. To start with a statement of the obvious, to reach net zero, we will need to mobilise significantly more climate finance and investment in support of developing economies. Developing economies face an increased threat from unpredictable sea levels, changing weather patterns, and compromised natural resources, with the repercussions of climate change not just threatening ecosystems but also economic development objectives. The impact will be particularly devastating for low-income countries which depend as a major proportion of their GDP on agriculture, forestry or fishing. In some regions, including southern Brazil, Paraguay and northeast Argentina, extreme water stress and heat waves have substantially reduced yields of key crops like maize and soybean in 2022, which is likely to have food security implications for the world over the year ahead. The UNFCCC estimates that as of 2021, the nationally determined contributions of 153 developing countries will require a total amount of almost $6 trillion US of investment up until 2030. And to meet these needs, at COP15, developed countries committed to a collective goal of mobilizing $100 billion US per year by 2020. At the request of donor countries, the OECD has regularly been tracking progress towards achieving this goal. This ensures transparency and accountability while identifying priorities for further progress. And our latest report, released last month, finds that developed countries jointly mobilized $89.6 billion US in climate finance for developing countries in 2021. Still more than $10 billion below the 2020 target, but a large 8% increase over the previous year of 2020. That is an increase which is significantly higher than the 2.1% average annual growth which was reported for the period 2018 to 2020. While the $100 billion US goal that was set for 2020 has not yet been achieved in 2021, our preliminary data available to the OECD indicates that countries look likely to have met that objective in 2022. That is ahead of our previous expectation, which was for that commitment to be met this year in 2023. This year, the OECD has also released 2 supplementary reports recommendations for bilateral and multilateral climate finance providers to address two components of climate finance that remain stubbornly low: adaptation finance and the mobilization of private finance by public finance. There's three priorities that I would like to highlight for you here this afternoon. First, we need to improve the effectiveness of public climate finance in helping us mobilize private finance. The increase in climate finance has been predominantly driven by increases in public finance, which has almost doubled from $38 billion US in 2013 to $73.1 billion in 2021. However, at the same time, private climate finance has not been increasing. In fact, our latest analysis shows that private climate finance has stagnated at around $14 billion US since 2017, while public climate finance increased about 35% over the same period. Governments can make further use of instruments such as syndicated loans, guarantees, risk insurance, and targeted grants, which have proven to be effective in mobilizing private finance, particularly for more mature sectors like clean energy, where the commercial landscape is rapidly improving. For other sectors central to the green transition, like agriculture and forestry, where opportunities for commercial green investment remain limited, new, innovative approaches will be needed to better crowd in private finance. For example, project aggregation and securitization can be used to package individual projects in developing countries so they form financial assets that can be easily accessed by foreign investors. Second, we need to strengthen developing countries' capacity to access, absorb, and effectively utilize climate finance. Investors repeatedly cite country risks, such as macroeconomic and exchange rate instability, policy uncertainty, and poor governance as real barriers to investment. In addition, a recent OECD survey of development finance providers identified a lack of capacity as one of the top three barriers to the mobilization of private finance. The OECD's best practices, such as our infrastructure toolkit, can help governments tackle legal and regulatory barriers while ensuring competitive markets, open procurement processes, and transparent project decision-making. We also provide advice on developing well-defined project pipelines and clear environmental policy frameworks to provide investors with the information and the certainty they need to be able to make investment decisions. The OECD's Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mobilization Program helps emerging economies strengthen conditions for finance and investment in clean energy. This includes capacity building and policy dialogue on renewable power, energy efficiency, and industry decarbonization. Tomorrow we will launch a report on good donor practices in supporting small island developing states' access to climate finance, which provides guidance on how donors can better design structured, dedicated programs to facilitate improved access to climate finance for these countries. Third, we need to step up adaptation finance to build resilience and reduce climate-related damages and their economic costs. We estimate that 17% more people in member countries of the OECD International Programme for Action on Climate are exposed to hot summer days in 2021 compared to 1979. Adaptation finance is essential to building resilience, for example, by reducing climate-related damages and their economic costs. Our analysis shows, though, that adaptation finance actually fell from $28.6 billion in 2020 to $24.6 billion in 2021, a drop of some 14%. The fragmented adaptation finance architecture and complex eligibility requirements are key barriers developing countries face in accessing adaptation finance. Different donors set varying eligibility criteria, funding mechanisms, and administrative requirements, which makes navigating the climate finance system more challenging than it should be for many developing countries. International development and climate finance providers can enhance the delivery and support of adaptation finance by using country platforms as a single focal point to channel and coordinate technical assistance and international finance. The Just Energy Transition Partnerships established to mobilize finance for carbon mitigation in South Africa, Indonesia, Senegal and Vietnam could, for example, be a model for climate change adaptation as well. These partnerships help ensure high-level political commitment, bring together different types of international providers and methods of adaptation finance, and using public money strategically to mobilize private finance. So in closing, a globally coordinated, effective and fair response to climate means ensuring developing countries get the quantity and the quality of finance that they require. Through our work to track the progress of developed countries in providing climate finance to developing countries and our reports on adaptation finance and mobilizing private finance, the OECD is supporting the coordination between governments and multilateral providers and the mobilization of private sector finance needed to help make that happen. In addition, we are helping scale up blended finance to optimize the impact of public spending. Early next year, we will be launching the African Virtual Investment Platform to help mobilize high-quality investment for priority projects across Africa. We're supporting the new Global Financing Pact Summit roadmap, including by hosting its secretariat with its own deliverables around the mobilization of private finance for sustainable development, and we will continue to explore further opportunities to help achieve our objectives. So thank you for the opportunity to say a few words up front at this event here this afternoon, and I look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Matthias. That's set the scene for this event very, very well, and I hope it's whetted the appetite for everyone in the audience to look through the various reports that Matthias mentioned. Now, Minister Guibault, can I invite you to the floor to make some remarks?
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you, Matthias, for the overview, but more so thank you for your leadership and all of the team at the OECD for this work you did over the years, and with the contributors community to strengthen the confidence around the delivery of the $100 billion goal. Colleagues, COP28 happens as we experienced the warmest year ever recorded. We know that keeping 1.5 within reach is only possible if we increase the quantity and quality of financial flows. And I ask you today, what should the climate finance story be out of COP28? Yes, contributors likely met the $100 billion goal last year, but this milestone is just a beginning. I've heard loud and clear from developing countries articulating the needs for trillions of dollars annually to support climate action. I believe in a story of climate finance that is built on honesty, partnerships, and ambition. These are, for me, the three benchmarks of success for a positive and forward-looking finance outcome at COP28. Let me unpack this for you. First, to strengthen international cooperation and increase partnership to support adaptation and mitigation everywhere, we need to scale up finance from all sources: domestic, international, public, and private. Strengthening partnerships means considering the needs are growing, and current mobilization of financial flows is just not enough. At COP15, we asked ourselves a similar question: how to support the implementation of biodiversity goals everywhere. And in Montreal, we agreed collectively to mobilize $200 billion from all sources to support the implementation of the GBF by 2030. Second, I'm committed to supporting more transparency for climate finance. That is the key to establishing trust and improving predictability of finance. I've heard this from CARICOM ministers and their leaders who were in Canada lately at the CARICOM summit at the invitation of the Prime Minister Trudeau. I've heard it as well from many dear colleagues from Africa and everywhere around the world, as well as many here in the room. That's why I'm so grateful to the work that Jennifer and I and our teams have done to demonstrate progress on climate finance. We issued 2 joint letters to identify areas we need to improve. Adaptation finance is a priority, and as Matthias has just outlined, the numbers for 2021 are lower than we would have hoped. Our commitment remains undeniable. At COP26, the Glasgow Climate Pact urged us to double our adaptation finance by 2025 from 2019 levels. And let me say, I am confident we will reach this goal. After Glasgow, contributors strengthened their commitments on adaptation. Today, we're confident that we can deliver on our respective pledges. But we've not been able to tell our story well. The OECD data for 2021 does not yet capture these efforts. And I understand if current efforts still raise doubts about our commitment on adaptation. Above all, our signs of progress at times feel distant. But I want to reassure our partners, Canada will work constructively to find any opportunity to close the information gaps on adaptation finance. Third, if we want to increase ambition, we need to do a better job to mobilize private finance at the scale required to meet the growing needs. Let's be honest, our data is not showing the breakthroughs we would have hoped. As contributors, we can better tailor public finance to effectively leverage more private resources. Despite how technical or complex these terms can sound, what matters at the end of the day is that developing countries access and can use these funds. That's why we must improve access modalities within multilateral development banks. I was pleased to see a substantial increase in climate finance from the NDBs in 2022, and that collective targets set in 2019 were surpassed before the 2025 deadline. If we want to improve access to finance, as contributors, we should commit to using every possible effort to get MDBs to be more responsible and ambitious as well as effective. Colleagues, if I can share both good signs and elements that require further work, it is because we are starting to address systemic and long-standing challenges. And that, for me, is positive. It's a forward-looking step. I am more determined than ever to continue this cooperation and to overcome these challenges. I want us to create the conditions to scale up finance from all sources and invest in projects that support action on the ground and support our highest possible climate ambition and development aspirations. You can call me an optimist, but I believe we have an opportunity to do this with the post-2025 goal, and this is where a big part of our attention is needed now. I hope that discussions on this in the coming days will be productive. Thank you again to the OECD for their invaluable work and insight in this issue. A special thanks again to my colleague Jennifer and the team in Germany for our joint efforts with contributors to provide further and more detailed insight into climate finance. Jennifer and I may have decided to start calling ourselves cheerleaders on this work from now on. To close, Canada wants to be a partner on climate finance. You can count on us to push for a hopeful, transformational, and forward-looking outcome. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and took very good note of your three-part theme of honesty, partnerships and ambition. I think that was an inspiring and encouraging way to start off this session. So thank you both for opening the event for us. Now I'd like to invite our four panelists to join me on the stage. Well, thank you and welcome to our panelists who are each going to bring a very different perspective to the topic. Just by way of a quick introduction, Jennifer Morgan is the State Secretary and Special Representative for International Climate Policy at the Federal Foreign Office of Germany. In her professional career, Jennifer held various leadership positions, and I think I've probably known you in all of them, Jennifer, including as Director of the Global Climate Campaign of WWF International and Director of the Climate Program of the World Resources Institute, WRI. Ambassador Seni Nafo, I've also known for just about the same period of time. He's the coordinator of the African Adaptation Initiative Foundation, which aims to strengthen adaptation to climate impacts in Africa. And since 2011, he's also served as a spokesperson for the African Group of Nations, the AGN, in this process. Suzanne Gabouri I hope I pronounced
Yes,
that correctly.
very
Thank
good.
you. Is Director General for the Asian Development Bank's Private Sector Operations Department. She has more than 30 years of professional experience with the private sector in emerging market finance. And finally, Amar Bhattacharya is Senior Fellow in the Centre for Sustainable Development at Brookings Institution. Now, prior to this, Amar served as Director of the Group of 24, an intergovernmental group of developing country finance ministers and central bank governors. So his extensive experience also includes a long career in the World Bank. So let's dive into the discussion with some questions. Now I'm going to ask one that I'm going to pose for all speakers and just ask you to give maybe a 3-minute response. Now, as Matthias indicated, the progress report for 2021 showed a healthy, pretty close to 8% increase in the amount of climate finance provided and mobilised compared to 2021, but still fell short of the 100 billion target by $10 billion. So in your view, what has been the main challenge in reaching the $100 billion goal, and what steps can be taken to address that challenge? Who would like to start? Amar.
So I'm going to be provocative to start the conversation. So the main reason, we underperformed is that we underperformed on investment, not on finance. We just did not have the investment in place. Yes, finance is a constraint, but equally important, we were not able to scale up investments for climate action in the way that was necessary to unlock the investments. That's the demand side I want to emphasize very much. Second, the numbers speak for themselves. So if you look at the supply side of finance, we have done exceptionally well from the multilateral development banks. And indeed, that's the reason why we have close to the target. The bilateral side has increased, but by a much smaller number. And within the bilateral side, as we know, we've had particularly 2 challenges: adaptation finance. Also, I should emphasize the share of grants is very small. And the last point, as the OECD report points out, is another number that has been very stagnant has been the private mobilisation part. I'm sure you'll come back to that later, but that's what the analysis says. So the numbers speak for themselves, but I do want to emphasize that, because this is a very much a forward-looking agenda as well, the necessity to put in place the conditions, not project by project, but for scaling up investments for the transformations we need.
Thank you. Nice and succinct, but very provocative and to the point. Jennifer, I'll move to you.
Yeah, first of all, just to say it's great to be here, and thanks to Stephen and your team, the Canadian team, for all the work that we did together. And I think we've been looking at this quite carefully, and thanks also from us to the OECD as well. I mean, I think maybe to build on what Amma's saying is, we noticed a number of different bottlenecks, and I think part of it, it's this kind of the enabling conditions, but the long, loud legal signals, the capacity in countries to be able to absorb. I think those are some of the bottlenecks that we've seen. That's why our International Climate Initiative actually focuses quite a lot on building that capacity and on in developing countries to do that. Also to identify, really understand the priorities of countries very clearly, so that then the funds are going into what is needed systemically, but also in the gaps that they have, so that you don't have kind of a parallel process that doesn't match the actual needs on the ground, and the mobilization of private finance. I think we had big hopes at the beginning, but they didn't yet result. The EU numbers this year were a bit more promising 2022 was 28.5 billion euro in public finance, an additional 11.9 billion euros in private finance. So, you know, but I think digging into some of the work of the OECD on that would be key. And, you know, looking at some of the more innovative approaches like structured funds to attract private investors by, you know, the public sector taking over some of the first loss tranche, and then reducing some of the risks. And I think here, I'd be curious what the panel thinks about how to tap more into the potential of guarantees. We've started to take a look at this, and it just seems like it's a very fragmented space and I've heard just so much from various countries, particularly in the renewables field, about how the cost of capital in Africa is 8 times as high. So how, you know, getting a bit more tailored perhaps on that as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, and some very specific suggestions there, which I hope will provoke discussions. Seni, I'm going to turn to you now.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I think the biggest mistake we did with the reason why we you know, the biggest challenge was actually methodological. What we did, the mistake, well, we, not we, but those who make ministers and heads of states. So when the commitment was taken, we should have agreed with accounting rules. We should have agreed from day one how we were going to count an account, and we didn't. To this day, actually, there is no common comparable rules to count an account. And it's the reason that you can have so many different reports, and I really have to thank the OECD for having the political courage to actually do that, because you know that was, you know, some of us working on the Standing Committee on Finance, which is the body which advised the COP on financial matters. We tried to sort of have a mandate. So the biggest challenge was that, and is still, but there is no rules to count an account, which is sort of agreed by everyone. So we are, for instance, in a situation that we have an OECD report which says, okay, we're only about 10 billion, but then the UNEP GAP report is telling you you're 25% down on adaptation from 2021, whereas in Glasgow we should have had a 25% year increase. So you create sort of a dissonance of, so where are we? Are we actually increasing or decreasing? So that one is methodological, and that's on all of us. The second is that if you look at the quantum of resources, this is mainly, the majority is loan or credit. And if you're going to be working in climate in developing countries' geographies, whether you want to use loan for reducing emissions or for adapting is going to be very, very different. You might, in investing in clean energy, have a lot more options or a lot more investments in renewable energy, but even there, it's not that clear cut. You might need a lot of risk mitigation resources, a lot of resources to do preparation, rather than even, you know, providing loan. In adaptation, totally different. Adaptation is very bottom up. I think there have been many assessments. Most of the activities don't, in and of themselves, generate return. And if you want adaptation investments, meaning you want to invest in adaptation and generate a return, then you need to build that pipeline. You need to build the portfolio. You need to build that whole market. So because of all of that, and we'll get, I think there's the issue of the pipeline. We can get into that. So that's also a challenge. The third one is political will. 100 billion is in and of itself, compared to the trillions of liquidity which have been injected in the last few years for all kinds of reasons. There's political will. Somehow this is not on the top of the agenda for whatever the reason. That's also, and I'll stop there. But I really want to thank the OECD for providing the data. In the report on mobilization, some of the recommendations are extremely relevant technically in mobilizing private finance and in scaling up adaptation. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, thank you, Sonia, and I think you also have been quite provocative, introducing a number of the challenges you can see there. So hopefully in our discussion we can address them a bit further. Suzanne, your comments on this first question that was asked of everybody, what's been standing in the way and what steps can be taken to address it?
Thanks. I feel like there's all kinds of issues here that I'm not sure which to address first, but I think that, you know, having been involved in private sector finance and emerging markets for 30 years, you do see trends happening. And the one thing that I do see is that there's a greater awareness now, far more than there ever was. So I think that that's a positive. I think that we don't all have the tools. We know that, that due to various vulnerabilities, climate change, many countries are exposed to this, and there's a lot of different issues that countries are facing. It's not all the same. This morning, for example, we signed a framework agreement with Indonesia for the coal reduction in coal usage for a thermal power plant in Cirebon 1. And it's not easy. There are no clean solutions to this, so you need to come together. There's lots of things that are going on, and I think that the pace of transition needs to accelerate. That I completely agree with. The enabling environment, I think, is absolutely key for the private sector to come in. The regulatory environment, as you just mentioned, taxes, how this is all dealt with is incredibly important. Financing sources, we hear a lot about coming from governments, different kinds of financing tools, multilaterals, ODA type financing, private sector participation, de-risking, guarantees, concessionality, mobilization. So these are all really important things, and there isn't, I won't say there's no one solution for any of this. You need a plethora of this, and it requires partnerships. One of the things I have to say is that during our time at COP here within ADB and the private sector, we're signing $12 billion in supporting private sector renewable energy, clean energy. So, we're trying to scale up. We're really trying to be conscious of these types of things. So you will need all these tools as part of that. And I will also say that, the regulatory framework and the investment environment, that really, truly is, because the private sector won't go into areas where they feel the risk is too high. So we need to work together. There's other tools that you can bring into this: advisory, planning, technology, ESG, technical assistance, and as you said, just transition. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration. And one of the things that we've tried to do within ADB is that we've undertaken a reorganization recently where you try to get the private sector to inform the public sector on policy reforms so that you can create a kind of a virtuous circle for changes in the enabling environment. So there's lots of different things that need to be done, but I think that, again, enabling environment, regulatory, taxes, blended finance guarantees, and it is difficult to actually bring everyone together on this. So we will all need to come together.
Okay, not a simple problem to solve, multiple facets to it. So I'm going to move to a next question, and for this one, just a reminder that we are recording the session, so be good to speak nice and close to the mic. Now I've got a question focusing more on adaptation, and I want to ask Jennifer and Amar first. Adaptation finance often focuses on small-scale and very context-specific projects. Now that doesn't work so well for investors, and given the environment within which we're working, how can you get a better match between the characteristics of adaptation activities and projects with the expectations of investors and financiers? So if one of you would take that first. So matching up characteristics and expectations. Thank you.
So indeed, adaptation is multi-level. You do need country strategies on adaptation. It's an economy-wide issue. And at the same time, adaptation goes down all the way down to the communities and the individual. So it is multi-level. Now, from a financing point of view, we know that it is difficult for people to think about the future at a time, particularly in developing countries, when there are many pressing demands of the day. So one of the impediments to adaptation is just the sheer difficulty of saying, this is coming, we now need to do something about it. So adaptation strategies at all levels, the level of the government, the level of the cities, the level of a community, the level of a business, that is absolutely has to be the starting point. Second, yes, financing is difficult for two reasons. One is adaptation may not be directly revenue generating. There are some adaptation that is revenue generating, but most adaptation tends to be savings generating. It generates savings. Those savings can be in two forms. It can be internalized to a company or an entity, in which case it makes sense for that to be invested in and to be financed, but sometimes the gains of that savings is spread over a large number of players, like a seawall, for example. So in that kind of case, you will have a difficulty. The last point, which is the one you started with, is a lot of these are too small ticket items. They are just not big enough to be able to be financed. And second, the entities are not creditworthy. So you need, and this is, by the way, not just a challenge for adaptation, it's a challenge even for the renewable sector. You need aggregation structures, and you need credit enhancing mechanisms that would make it viable, especially for institutional capital. Now, these, so the theory of it is pretty clear, but we have not developed really replicable, scalable models, and that's where the attention needs to be in this space.
Well, thank you for that. Jennifer.
Yeah, maybe just to build on that, in some ways I think all of us, and this isn't just in developing countries, but all of us have to have a mindset shift to be actually integrating climate and the impacts of climate into everything that we do. I mean, that's your point as well. So Germany just putting together an adaptation strategy sector by sector with the science, informing it, and then looking at it as a whole. You need to have a sense of the costs there, and to be thinking it all together. And I think you have to get to this point of thinking climate and development together, so that it's not an either or, and it can't be an either or, but I think it's often understood that way. So on the adaptation piece, really, and being quite specific. So part of it, I think, on the scale of the projects, definitely I touched, and Arma did as well, on the de-risking instruments, that type of thing, on blended finance, or those are all relevant, also relevant for small scale adaptation and projects as for mitigation. And I think, just to say the obvious, the local context of this is key in the discussion here, and I'm super curious what Sandy's going to say about all of this, but we're trying to get this guiding star on the global level. We need an adaptation cycle, but we need the actual climate information in a way, and the goals across like water, health systems, all of these things. But then it has to be locally owned and locally informed from everything, all the people I've talked to and learned from in my travels. So, looking at the local institutions and how to be integrating it in there and building the knowledge and the capacity there to be making those links and getting the bankable projects, and also, the buy-in of the local communities, and also to bring in to attract the investors. There are, the political frameworks here as well. You mentioned adaptation strategies and national adaptation plans. I'd like to know what we need to do differently, because we don't have enough. And so how do we do those differently? Sometimes I feel that, for example, in fragile states, there's these two different worlds, where you have fragile states or very small countries that are in the midst of emergencies. Often then humanitarian aid comes in, but they're not they're not yet even in the room of kind of having a national adaptation plan that can access adaptation funding or other funding. So what do we need to be doing there? Role of climate risk insurance, and what are the tools? I know insurance, in the German context, in our Global Shield initiative, there the insurance is more to be looking at how can the Global Shield actually be paying the insurance premiums, not the people on the ground. So, but what are some of those innovative solutions we need to bring in?
Could I just ask, when you refer to national adaptation plans not being enough, do you mean there are not enough of them, or they are not hitting the mark in terms of how they are set out?
I think both. I mean, there's clearly not enough of them, that's for sure. But then, when I was reading for the Global Stocktake, the work that was done around adaptation and scaling up the adaptation and meeting that gap, the lack of the information to be provided, the climate information that's needed in order to be able to inform then and be clear about what's needed in terms of the investment also seems to be a barrier.
Thanks for that. Now that's probably a nice segue. I'm going to ask a slightly different adaptation-related question, but feel free, both of you, on my left, to pick up on anything you've heard before. But I wanted to now look a little bit more detail at the question of investable projects, a pipeline of investable projects, because we do hear that is a big cause for the bottleneck for adaptation financing, that lack of investable pipelines. So what I would be keen to hear from is, in your view, the key initiatives or frameworks that could facilitate the development of robust, investment-ready adaptation projects.
Thank you, Joe. I mean, I really want to answer that question and being as specific and pragmatic and business-oriented. So when we say that there is a lack of investment pipeline, we in the initiative are trying to really, and we'll be interested if there's anyone in the room who find himself or herself in that solution of having resources, wanting to invest in Africa in adaptation, saying, I don't have a pipeline, I want really to sit down with you. Interesting enough, a few months ago in Montreal, I had a big meeting with a large pension fund, especially on that question, on we want to deploy $1 billion and we don't have a pipeline. And I said, okay, usually pipelines are specific. Every financial institution, just the way it will present a project to its board, will have different criteria. If you take a project to the Green Climate Fund, it's going to be, to what the GCF might consider bankable, maybe another institution will find it bankable. So what we have understood now, to sort of break away from that conversation, which has been going on for too long, is we are ready, and we've started it, to do pipeline-specific programs. So for that specific institution, the conversation was, okay, give me a template. Give me the template of the project which goes to your board. Give me your conditionalities. Give me your financial instruments, meaning even give me the countries where you want to invest, because if you can only invest in 2 countries and I'm giving you a project in 23, then that's not going to work. So when we have all that information on the supply side of this is my template, this is the kind of information I want, I'm only going to provide 10% 3 years, then we will tailor investment for you so that we get up, so that this chicken and egg game, okay, we can't invest, there's no project. We've started that. We are launching actually with the European Union, the AAI is launching with the European Union, a project preparation facility, which will be just targeting that. The largest private equity fund on the continent in Africa, $15 billion, they launched an infra-resilient climate fund. They have pipeline. There is a large US fund here, I won't name their name, they have pipeline. So that conversation, I really want to get to a point of let's be extremely granular. Those who have resources and are looking for pipeline, let's look at it, because the situation has changed just in the last 2-3 years. It has really changed. We're not there yet, but we're now in a position to really develop specific pipeline for specific financial institutions. So that's one. The element of scale, that's true. The element of scale and adaptation is local context specific. And the difficulty that we're having in approaching that is that in our processes here, or for the 30, 40 years that we've been in, or 30 years of this convention, we've been very mitigation focused. So mitigation has been extremely top down to the point that the planning and all of that can be done thousands of miles away. You can plan, you can mobilize, you can maybe even execute from thousands of miles away. Mitigation is extremely bottom up. Mitigation, adaptation, but we're ready now to do aggregation. We're aggregating now to sort of reach that scale and start getting better financial conditions. We have concrete programs to be able to do that kind of a work. And again, I'm ready for a very specific conversation of how do you take a village or a rural community, come up with a set of intervention to increase at a certain point income per capita, because that's maybe the greatest adaptation you can do is to put more money in the pockets of women to sort of deal with adaptation. And then how do you create total new asset class, new financial instruments, new financial vehicles, and new assets class to be able to deal with that. And on most of those programs, we've started them. So, as I said, we're very ready to have very concrete proposals to address some of those challenges.
Oh, really interesting. And I've got one very quick follow-up, and that is you talked about the multiplicity of processes and assessment criteria that the different funds have in place. Is there room, would it make your life easier? Is there room for some streamlining of that? Would that help with the pipeline of projects?
It would definitely help, but the reality is that we failed that. We failed that declaration of Paris, the harmonization of donors. We failed. We failed in sort of every institution. I actually organized a small workshop with friends and said, okay, this is this cooperation. Here's go and try to fill your own template. So we have. So actually, the breakthrough right now is maybe in AI and machine learning, because many of those elements in a template are repetitive. So we're actually going that way to sort of gain on time. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to sort of have one template for MDBs. That would be great if they could. If all the MDBs could get together and say, hey, okay, you want to do an adaptation in ag, this is one template and similar. But we haven't, unfortunately, been able to do that.
Perhaps we can send that message back for sure. Suzanne, again, to you for your comments on this question of a pipeline of investable projects.
That's a tough question. So I do agree with your comment. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg at times. So just to put it into context, I guess for an Asia and the Pacific. So adaptation finance accounted for 8% of total finance flows within Asia and the Pacific. A recent report that came out of a total of almost 41 billion. So of that, the private sector only counted of 0.2% for all climate adaptation, which is $84 million. So those are some pretty stark numbers, I think, that just show the scale of what the issue is. And I think that, again, from the private sector, when you look at this, the barriers to increasing adaptation finance, as we mentioned, are very varied and often complex. So, first, I would say firstly and commercially, investors, when it comes down to the revenue model for a business model that you're investing in, adaptation is typically seen as a increased cost versus mitigation is, opportunity. So there needs to be this understanding of where the revenue component comes in. For most of the type of things that we're doing in adaptation, it's usually in agribusiness or sometimes in renewable energy, but not that often, but also through financial institution side of things. So it makes it, again, very complex. Then the other thing, too, is that, talking to your point about harmonization, it's definitional issues. What everyone understands and constitutes an adaptation relevant activity is very subjective compared to the mitigation side. And this, because of the subjectivity, can actually deter, investment in that. So I think that, discussions about harmonization and I would also say framework approaches would be very, very helpful. And just sheer awareness and understanding. Again, there is, I would say in the private sector, not the great degree of understanding that there could be on what both adaptation looks like, but also where that could actually be. Because every deal that we look at, for example, we look at it from a climate perspective. We have a climate investment team. They look at this as a mitigation, adaptation. And even though we have very experienced bankers looking at this, they still, are kind of, trying to figure themselves out on this. So, what are we trying to do? I think, the other idea that, or the other thing that's putting out there is about increased investments. There are opportunities. I think there's a lot of liquidity out there as well, but it may not be with the right tools going to the right place. We're coming up with new tools, new ways of doing things. So again, new tools could be sustainability-linked loans, sustainability-linked bonds, where you're trying to bring in adaptation or dual use for both adaptation and mitigation in different products. There's all kinds of examples that I could give you on that with some of the stuff that we've been doing with regards to cashmere value chains in Mongolia, implementation of drip and affordable rainwater in farmers in Bhutan, aquaculture, climate resilient aquaculture in Vietnam. So it requires really broad thinking outside the box, I think often. And with that then, early stage investment, project preparation as you're talking about, but also, what does that mean? What are people looking for? Technical assistance, and there's all kinds of different ways. So what we're trying to do also is that with regards to, ADB recently announced our climate ambition, our climate change action plan at COP, but we're trying to focus that in on the private sector. So we're calling that a climate ambition plan, which also includes blue sky in there. And you need to look at what are the new tools that are required, what are the de-risking elements that are required. And then one thing that I do completely agree on is harmonization. That, I think, is one of the biggest areas that we need to work on together as multilaterals, because there still isn't agreement on a lot of what could be relatively simple areas, but they're not, because they're, every organization is different, made up of different shareholders with different complexities. But there are lots of different things that you can work on and also come up with new solutions. Coming up, and as to your point, I used to be a fund manager in a previous life, so I hear what you're saying with regards to some of these different aspects of looking at things for scaling up. It is, again, where we can need to work together on coming up with solutions for this. And I think that, working with public and private much more closely is where, and creating common understandings of things. Sometimes you use the same words, but they may not understand them from different perspectives. So again, lots of work to be done, but again, I am hopeful. Things have changed, and they are changing.
That's good to know. Things are changing. And I think you made an important point there, because in the OECD report, there is a chunk of the finance that's been provided and mobilised that we describe as cross-cutting. So it meets both mitigation and adaptation objectives, and I think that's an important point as well. Your comments there about the private sector and public sector working together is a good segue to a last couple of questions that are focused on private finance. So I'm going to do a bit of gender separation and ask Jennifer and Suzanne. First question here for the two of you is, what financial approaches and mechanisms could international providers scale up or develop to significantly increase the mobilisation of private finance for climate action? So you've touched on a few already, so perhaps you could just elaborate a wee bit. Suzanne, go for it.
Thanks very much. Last year we were able to mobilize, we brought in external funds for ADB at $7.1 billion for private sector operations. So it's very much a clear focus of ours. And so with the mobilization numbers, I think that what is also clear is that you do need to have very clear targets within this. And I think that when you're bringing in different types of instruments, mobilization, you need to bring in third-party capital, you need to bring in different tools. In fact, you know, part of my conversations that I've been having at COP is with different types of investors. How can we work together? How can we bring in private capital to these types of investments, be it short-term, long-term? You know, we have a very large trade finance program, which is, you know, short-term capital, but it's very large and where you can actually bring in a lot of commercial banks. We work with insurance companies. You know, you have direct syndications. You know, some of the things that you've mentioned already with credit insurance, funded and unfunded platforms, partial credit guarantees, de-risking instruments. And so for us, that's been really important. So we're very grateful to our partnerships with Canada, Australia, CTF, et cetera, as well as Japan, with regards to de-risking tools that really can make a difference with regards to bringing in third-party capital and also help de-risk projects. I wanted to give you one example of this. So recently we just signed a $1 billion project between Laos, and it's called the Monsoon. It's a 600 megawatt power project, wind project, where the power is being generated in Laos and is being evacuated into Vietnam. And what's interesting about this, so we were able to mobilize almost $600 million in debt financing from other commercial capital in this. But we also brought in debt financing from, and concessional financing from local commercial banks, international banks. And one of the things that we did use for the concessional capital, the blended financing, because the PPA, for example, wasn't bankable. So you de-risk that portion of the PPA, 25-year PPA, where you can make it bankable, and then you can bring in the private capital on that. So these kinds of tools are really important for this. And so we're happy that we have the ability to have concessional funds that are available. Of course, Green Climate Fund was mentioned. I will be going to Tokyo on the 6th of December to sign a new fund, a $1.5 billion fund with JICA, with the Japanese government. So these kinds of tools are super important to actually getting private sector. And that's what I think the key to mobilization is, but also very clear outcomes and expectations, because it's a resource or funding that is not cheap, and also at the same time it's precious from our shareholders, so we need to use it wisely. So again, lots of different ways that you can actually do this, but requires multiple tools, multiple ways of approaching it and using it.
Well, thanks very much, and it's good to hear of specific examples, and I do hope there are mechanisms for peer learning. You know, if things work, it'd be great if they could be shared and understood. Jennifer.
Yeah, just building on that as well. I mean, I think, as we all know, there's currently an MDB reform going on, which I think is a great, it's needed, and it's a good opportunity to step back and look at things like standards. And I think also on the regional development banks, how to be working more, what's the right word, in leveraging each other and us as well. Some of our financial or national financial institutions like a KFW, that type of thing, and looking at those standards. So that's one thought. I think the second is, which also can come into that reform, but also in national approaches, is policy-based approaches. So, we've been learning a lot, and we'll still be learning about through the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, how you take the goals of countries and their own, and how in these cases it's about accelerating a coal phase out, a just social transition, and then building up renewables, and how through that kind of collective set of goals and policy clarity, you can then be matching it with the different types of financial instruments that you need, almost like more of an ecosystem. I just feel like we have to bring it all together a bit more, and on the contributor side, having a readiness to actually work together. So, and I think that sounds so basic, but I think one of the things that on the JETP under the German G7 presidency, we were so keen to try and get away from, every country coming in. And then clearly, we're talking a lot about de-risking tools and the question of guarantees. We need to scale up the use of guarantees. They're currently mobilizing only 20% of private finance. And we just updated our sector guidelines for investor guarantees in Germany with a particular focus to strengthen and prioritize investments in green technologies. And so doing more of that, and we're currently looking at how to, as I said, try and create more of a strategic platform for all of these different instruments that seem to be quite underutilized, and be matching them then with country goals. Something that we're looking at for renewables in Africa, but it obviously can go much further than that. And I have to apologize because I have to take off, but this has been an excellent panel, so thank you very much.
Are there any last words you want to say before you make a run for the next event?
I guess the words I want to say is, I feel like we've been having, in the last year, I feel like we've accelerated a much more specific, collaborative conversation and set of changes than we have for a long time, and we just need to accelerate that and meet the moment, and learn from each other, so that we can actually get this done. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your time, and do understand the need constant at this COP to run from one thing to another. Look, I've just got a last question on private finance for Sani and for Amar, and that is really to want to hear from a beneficiary country perspective what seem to be the major barriers to mobilising or engaging the private sector in financing climate action. What do you think the barriers are from a beneficiary country perspective, and therefore what might be done to overcome them?
Well, there are several. The first challenge sometimes is language. Something as simple as that. If you are a Lusophone country and accessing finance requires you to write in English, that's going to be tough. That's an easy one, but a fundamental. Accessing finance is a full-time job. And I think that this is something we don't realize that much in our process. In the private sector, you have bankers whose only job is to do that. You have dedicated, this is a field, this is a profession. It's blending finance is a field. So, and adaptation and climate is even more complex. So simple project finance, their bankers that's the only thing they do. Adding climate is an additional complexity, because then you have to determine what is the climate rationale and what is that relationship. So being a climate investment banker is a full-time job, and I think that we don't realize that, because a climate investment banker would know when he or she happens in a country that, okay, my client actually needs to access 25 years at 2%, where he or she is being proposed 17% at 3 years. That won't work. So how do I then structure this transaction so that at the end of the day, those are the terms that I have? Can I get some project finance? Can I get some subsidies? Can I get some insurance here? Because this country needs to be, there's political risk here. So can I get some insurance? Can I get a bit of guarantee? Can I get some first equity loss here? So I get a junior. So all this to sort of make the intervention happen doesn't exist in most of the regions where we went. Actually, the more you're vulnerable, the more your local financial, banking, economic ecosystem is sort of extremely weak. So the one thing that we have to do, and this is what we're trying to do in a very meaningful manner, is to engage with the local financial, economic, banking ecosystem and see how we strengthen that. We really need to domesticate climate finance if it's going to work for adaptation. Mitigation, again, and renewables, very different. As I said, you can sit in Washington, design a plant, design it, mobilize the resources, and execute it without maybe even landing in that country. Adaptation is going to be a bit tough. So we really need to engage the local stakeholders in a manner that we have not. Like the subnationals, the local private sector, the local communities, that's going to require a bit more of that. And as I said, this is a full-time job, it's a profession, and we have actually had to, in the initiative, transform ourselves in that mentality to say, okay, we want this to happen. Those are all the barriers. How do we do that? Product preparation, de-risking, very concessional, because you're going to be testing new business models. In adaptation, many of the actions are new. Building a plant, you know how to do that. You know you need to secure a PPA. You know you need a guarantee. You know you need partial guarantee. But in a rural community adaptation project that you want bankable, that's totally new. So you need to have some, I call it some failure resources to be able to test a business model, to establish a business model, then to sort of scale in the kind of finance until this can be maybe totally private. So having a very acute sense of what is needed, as granular, as specific, local specific as possible, helps you a great deal. This is really not for top down. This is for very bottom up, and it's going to be very different in maybe even in the same country. If you are in a federation in the same country, the same intervention will be very different because the rules and regulation and even the finance will be extremely different.
Thank you for that. By the sounds of things, it's a recipe for minestrone soup. Many different ingredients needing to be brought together, hopefully to make a tasty dish. Emma, last word on mobilising private finance. How can we overcome the barriers?
So I'm going to, Joe, wear a different hat. So I'm also the Executive Secretary of the Independent High-Level Expert Group on Climate Finance. Sorry. I'm also the Executive Secretary of the Independent High-Level Expert Group on Climate Finance. Our report is coming out tomorrow. So I could tell you that the answers are in that report, but that would not be the right answer. So let me just give some messages. First of all, different, as was just pointed out, different investments require a different mix of finance. And the clean energy transition is the biggest private sector investment opportunity of this century. When you look at what has to be invested in the next 3 years, it's largely private sector, and it's revenue generating. Yes, there are risks, foreign exchange risks, policy-induced risks, credit risks, aggregation requirements, but they can be tackled. They are not being tackled at the moment because we have not created the ecosystem to both scale up the investment proposition, but also to do the de-risking that is necessary at the level and scale. But there's a tremendous amount of that is happening in the space. And we just heard about that from the Asian Development Bank. But in every, I also want to mention that beyond the MDBs, this is a space where bilateral institutions are extremely active. Huge innovations taking place. It's a very, very exciting time right now in terms of ways to think about scaling up private finance. But ultimately, this will require two things. It will require platforms because we do not have the time. We can't allow a kind of bottom-up approach, slow and steady. We will have to accelerate, and country sector platforms, both for mitigation but also for adaptation, like the ADB is doing in Bangladesh, are very powerful ways of creating a virtuous cycle of action. And the second is that we will need, as Jennifer Morgan pointed out, the development and deployment of a different kind of partnership. This is not about the MDBs mobilizing the private sector. The private sector doesn't need anybody to mobilize them. The private sector is fully capable of being mobilized. It really means having a partnership of co-creation of investment opportunities, of tackling the policy and institutional impediments, of de-risking structures that bring down the cost of capital, and doing this in a replicable way so that, we can have a solution. When you look at the default rates of renewables in Africa, it's a very good investment proposition. The problem is there's a big gap between the perception and the actual. So that's why we need, in some sense, to bring stakeholders together on this and create much more certitude in this business. Only then, will we get the results we point out. I just want to end by saying we are actually in a very exciting moment of time.
That is a good note on which to end the panel discussion. Now, I was going to ask, and I could still ask, for a 30-second each. What's one big thing you think that should be done, whether it's a change to mandates, a change to processes, something like that, that would really help to scale up public and private financing? So 30 seconds each, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Suzanne.
I think it involves everyone working together. It's truly about partnerships, collaboration, coordination, and local capital market development. I think that with all of that, where you're going to have the powerful aspect of it is in the local capital markets, so that you can, country-specific, as you're saying, but also then it does require partnerships across the board in order to do this in a collaborative and a coordinated basis, because everyone can't do exactly necessarily the same thing. But if you can have this common understanding, I think that would make a huge, huge difference. And local capital markets, local currency financing.
Great, thank you. Who's ready next? Emma, maybe.
We need a purposeful approach with accountability. We need to be able to say that, the meeting the Paris, let me just make a very stark point which we make in our report. We say that we need to triple renewables. In emerging markets and developing countries, we will need to increase renewables 5 to 7 times, not triple them. But instead of doing that, we are falling behind in emerging markets and developing countries. So if we have to do this, we have to have a clear goals that are being set, and we have to have accountability for that, including on the part of the countries themselves, including on the part of the MDBs, and including on the part of the private sector. We need to move from a table where everybody sits on different corners and says the other two parties are to blame, to now a real partnership where everybody comes together around collective action, but with clear accountability.
Thank you. And final words, Seni.
Well, I'll be quick. There's an African proverb which says that one cannot be shaved in his absence. We need direct engagement. We really need direct engagement. I've realized that we are not having enough direct engagement, that many have been speaking on our behalf, many have been doing all kinds of things on our behalf. As an African perspective, this is from an African perspective. What we're not having are the direct conversations. Some of, for some of the change that we need to see. So more of the kind of conversation that we're just having.
Excellent. Really good note to finish. And we do have a little time before we close for burning questions from the audience. I know there is somebody there who is eager to ask one. Do we have a microphone or something to...
Thank you very much for your presentations. I would like to make an observation, and I would like the representative from the Brookings Institute to comment, and that is in 2015, when the Paris Agreement came out, NATO military spending, the 31 countries of NATO spent $896 billion on their militaries. Now it's $1.2 trillion on their militaries. That's an additional $200 billion annually over the past 8 years. My country, Canada, that is co-sponsoring this event in the past 8 years, has increased military spending by 95%. And this year we're buying fighter jets, even though our country was on fire. I think we need to talk about redirecting public funds to the real priorities and that is, climate mitigation and adaptation, and not investing in this carbon-intensive militarism that's taking place in the United States and that's taking place in Canada and the other NATO countries. So I would like to see speakers, have the courage to talk about this really serious problem of military spending, locking us in to carbon-intensive militarism for decades ahead. So I would appreciate your reflection on that. Thanks.
It's all right. I'm an academic. I can say anything I want.
Joe, can I say something?
Amar first and then Sani.
So yes, indeed, one can question relative spending. We're spending about 1.3 trillion on climate right now, climate finance, and you're absolutely right that military spending dwarfs that. But I'll give you other spending that dwarfs it too. Fossil fuel subsidies dwarfs that. So there and agricultural subsidies and fossil fuel subsidies, which are harmful to climate and nature, are much higher. So yes, I totally agree on repurposing expenditure. But, of course, it's not, it's ultimately the job of, the leaders of this world to make those decisions. And it's the job of course, global citizenry to pressure them to make better choices.
Thanks. Sani.
Oh no, mine was to say something. I remember telling my colleagues, those who say that, we short on public resources and that's why we need the private sector, but that assumption is wrong. But we're not short on public resources. The monetary system, the global monetary system, is one which is fiat currency. We just print money. And I was telling that to my friends on the other side. In 2015, actually, this is to Professor, there were a group of economists who were working on climate quantitative easing. Very quantitative, actually, and I don't see that much of them anymore. Many of them came from France and MIT and sort of, which was basically, let's print what is required to be able to get the job done, because we are not short on public funds. And there's all kinds of examples. You have taken that specific one, but there's all kinds of examples which demonstrate that we're not short. When the political will is there to address a specific issue, resources are made available. So there is that, that was just the element I wanted to bring. In a fiat monetary currency, you just can print resources to address issues. So that was just my 2 cents.
Thank you for your 2 cents. And I think COVID came along, didn't it? And possibly interrupted that conversation. More questions from the audience in the front here.
Thank you very much. I have 2 simple questions. The first one is, how or why are we expecting my village farmer to go in for insurance when he or she has not been part of the problem? That is what I was expecting the lady from Germany to be, because I tend to get disappointed when farmers are being asked to pay premium in order for them to anticipate for a disaster. Meanwhile, they have limited access to loans and what have you, some in excess of 34% per annum. The second one is, you made a very interesting observation that how then do we get the political leadership to print the money to solve climate problems, especially adaptation?
Who would like to take those two simple questions, which probably don't have simple answers on. Sani, you look as though you're very keen.
I'm always happy to answer to simple questions. Simplicity is not a simple thing, but the reality on that one is that the world is not fair, and you better take insurance if you can. Unfortunately, in many cases, you won't because you can't pay the premium. You can't afford. Actually, it's not even about paying, it's the affordability. So there's a whole issue of how do you make insurance affordable. So that's a question. We can discuss about that. How do you make insurance affordable? But you should take insurance. I think that's a wise thing. You should take insurance. The equity part of that conversation is, what some of us have been dealing with, which is to say, as a continent, that we have not created the problem. We're going to be suffering the most of the problem, and even if we wanted to solve the problem, we won't be able to because we only have 4% of the emission. Hence the reason that we have to be serious at COP, because the 95% or 6% of the emissions are out of the continent. But the equity, so that's on the equity dimension. On the rest is the affordability of insurance. My bigger, and I'll finish with that, there's a philosophical point on insurance. Usually insurance is an appropriate financial instrument to deal with a phenomenon which is high impact and low frequency, or you can determine the frequency. Unfortunately, and that has really been my anxiety with insurance and climate, this phenomenon is getting worse. You're going to have more and more catastrophe. At least if the mitigation is continuing on the path, the non-ambition mitigation is continuing on that path. So more and more catastrophe, larger and larger impact. This is a recipe for bankruptcy if you are in the insurance business. So you either increase your premium to deal with that, or you get out of that business. That is the long-term conversation I have with my friends who've stayed in that field, to say, how are you, in a business where this is increasing every year, so you're going to be increasing your premium, or you're going to get away from it, or somebody is going to have to subsidize you, and if you securitize this, then that means you put that risk on the overall system. That's systemic problem, and that means we'll have a systemic problem very soon because a big insurance firm would have system. But anyway, I'll stop there in terms of the derivative problem. So, political will. What we're trying to do is to create instruments and vehicles. We're trying to really, so for instance, there's this idea of creating a multilateral guarantee fund, which will just provide the guarantees against a portfolio. So if you are in a country and your country is just, below investment grade, you would sort of have access to insurance guarantees and before you solve the big political leadership. But you can create specific vehicles to deal with some of that so that you can get your action implemented. Thanks.
Sorry, I just need to remind you, 5 minutes left.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, wherever that came from.
You're
Over
welcome.
there somewhere.
You're
Over
welcome.
there. I think we have time for one very quick question, and then I'm going to wrap up. If there's anyone who would like to ask a question. If not, I'll go straight to conclusion. Very quickly.
Thank you very much. My name is Kelly. I'm from Canada. I negotiate climate finance. In sort of my own self-interest, I wondered if any of you had thoughts on, because we've heard a lot from all of you on sort of the lessons that we've learned on climate finance over the last 10, 15 years, if you had thoughts on what the future of climate finance should look like while we're talking about the new goal here at this COP. Thanks.
Any comment? Anyone? Emma.
Yeah. I want to flag a quite important outcome from this COP, and that's the climate finance framework declaration coming from a set of important world leaders. It was co-signed, as you know, by President Biden, by, of course, the President of the Emirates, President Macron, Prime Minister Modi, Chancellor Scholz, President Rutte, the President of Ghana. And the reason I flag that is because, you know, there is commonality of purpose if there's commonality of understanding. And that is a framework. And I mean, I could go over it, but, you know, it's in the public domain. It accords very closely with the report that we are putting out tomorrow, which is we have to ensure that finance is for a purpose, and we have to understand that purpose. We have to use all available means of finance, and everybody has to contribute to that. And, you know, in some sense, this is not a horse race between development or climate. It's not a horse race between domestic resources and private resources. And actually, a lot of the solutions that we are talking about are now quite evident. And if we did it, it's not just delivering on climate, it's about delivering on a much better form of growth than we have been on in the past.
Well, thank you very much for that now, and really appreciate. You've got 10 seconds, Sen.
Don't set up a goal, a quantitative goal. Please, not a new 100 trillion, no, not a number, no numbers, no numbers.
Okay, thank you for that. I think it's been a really fascinating and very lively panel discussion. I don't even think I've got the time to begin kind of reaching a conclusion, but I just want to really emphasize the positive things that have been said. That we are in there's better awareness that things have changed and things are changing for the better, that solutions are in sight, and that as long as we look for harmonization and as long as we try to encourage direct engagement, we will find those solutions and roll them out, hopefully in an accelerated way. And I do hope these lessons can inform the discussions on the new collective quantified goal. It does seem to have quantified in it, Seni, on climate finance. It's really evident that despite the progress we've made, there's some important challenges that remain. And we should take what we've learned because our experiences can be a guide in setting a new goal that's not only more effective, but also better tailored to meet the specific needs of beneficiary countries. And we also need to design a goal that reflects the ever-evolving dynamics of the international financial architecture. And I've taken on board your point, Seni, that the methodology probably needs to be thought about up front rather than afterwards. So with that, I do want to express my heartfelt thanks to our panellists for the time and the great insights they've given. A big thank you to our audience for your active participation. Thanks to Canada for co-organising this event. And to the
Sorry to interrupt, we're out of time, sorry.
I do want to remind you as we go that this event can be watched on demand on the OECD COP28 Virtual Pavilion and the UNFCCC YouTube channel. So thank you all very much, and great that you stayed through to the end and even slightly beyond.